The wind had a name in Wyoming, and that name was a curse. It was born in the jagged teeth of the mountains and came screaming across the plains with nothing to stop it, a relentless beast of ice and fury. It scoured the land, stripping warmth from bone and hope from the heart. For Ethan Rollins, the wind was just another voice in the silence of his sprawling, empty house, a house built for laughter, now home only to memory and the bitter cold. At 32, Ethan owned more land than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. The Rollins Ranch was a kingdom of cattle, timber, and endless, snow-dusted horizons. He was a wealthy man, a powerful man. He was also a ghost, haunting the halls of his own life. It had been 3 years since the fever took Sarah, and 6 months after that, his boy, Thomas, they lay buried beneath the lone cottonwood on the hill. And with them, they had taken every piece of Ethan that knew how to feel anything other than the gnawing ache of loss or the cold calculus of running his empire. His days were a ritual of hard work. He rode with his men, his face a granite mask against the biting wind. His orders clipped and precise, he managed accounts, negotiated cattle prices, and oversaw the brutal, necessary work of survival in a land that was always trying to kill you. But when night fell, and the last of his ranch hands had retired to the warmth of the bunkhouse, the silence would descend. It was a physical weight, pressing in on him from the high-beamed ceilings of the great room, whispering from the empty chair beside the hearth where Sarah used to sit, mending his shirts. He'd pour a whiskey, the amber liquid a fleeting warmth in his gut, and stare into the flames. He saw their faces there, in the dancing light. Sarah's easy smile, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, Thomas's unruly shock of dark hair, his small hand clutching a wooden horse Ethan had carved for him. The fire was a cruel comfort, a living thing in a dead house. It was into this frozen world that she arrived. Abigail Thorne. He barely registered her at first. She was just another girl from back east, hired by his stern, efficient housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, another pair of hands to sweep the floors, make the beds, and remain invisible. She was from Ohio. Mrs. Henderson had said, young, maybe 19 or 20, and in need of work. Ethan had grunted his assent, not even looking up from his ledger. People came and went in the West. They were driftwood on a harsh sea, seeking purchase on any shore that would have them. He had no time for their stories. He had enough ghosts of his own. But Abigail was different. She wasn't invisible. She tried to be, but her silence was of a different quality than the oppressive silence of the house. His was a dead, hollow silence. Hers was a living, breathing thing, heavy with unspoken words. He started noticing her in fragments, the way she moved, with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the drudgery of her tasks. She didn't shuffle, she glided, her worn dress whispering over the polished floorboards. When she cleaned the ashes from the hearth, she did it with a strange reverence, as if tending a sacred flame. He saw her once through the window, pausing in her task of shaking out a rug to look toward the snow-capped mountains. Her expression one of profound, aching loneliness that mirrored his own. She was plain, by the standards of the saloon girls in Cheyenne. Her hair was a simple brown, pulled back severely from a face that was pale and thin. But her eyes were a deep, clear gray, like a winter sky just before a storm. They held a sorrow that made her seem far older than her years, and they were watchful. She never looked at him directly, but he often felt their fleeting touch as she passed through a room. A soft, questioning glance that vanished the moment he might have met it. The other maids chattered and laughed in the kitchens, their voices a brief, jarring intrusion he tolerated. Abigail never joined them. She ate her meals quickly, her head bowed, and retreated to the solitude of her work or the small, Spartan room she was given in the attic. One evening, a week or two after her arrival, Ethan came in from the cold later than usual. A branding iron had broken, and he'd stayed in the forge, hammering it back into shape himself, the sweat and heat a welcome distraction. He entered the house, shaking the snow from his hat, and found the great room empty, save for the crackling fire. He was about to shrug off his heavy coat when he noticed it. A thick wool blanket, one of Sarah's, was draped over the back of his armchair, and on the small table beside it sat a steaming mug. He lifted it, inhaling the scent of chamomile and honey. Mrs. Henderson was a good housekeeper, but she was not a sentimental woman. This was not her doing. He sank into the chair, the warmth of the mug seeping into his frozen fingers. He didn't drink the tea. He just held it, letting its heat be a small anchor in the cold emptiness. He knew, without knowing how, that Abigail had left it for him. It was a gesture of simple, unobtrusive kindness, an act that asked for nothing in return. It was the first crack in the ice that had encased his heart for 3 long years. He began to watch her more deliberately after that. He saw how she would leave a small bowl of water out for the stray dog that sometimes haunted the back porch. He saw the gentle way she handled the worn books in his study as she dusted, tracing a title with a slender finger before carefully replacing it. These were small, insignificant things, yet they spoke of a tenderness that had long been absent from his world. They were embers of warmth in a house gone cold. His nights remained his personal hell. Sleep was a fickle visitor, often chased away by nightmares. He'd wake in a cold sweat, the phantom sounds of Sarah's labored breathing or Thomas's weak cries echoing in his ears. On those nights, he'd sit by the fire until dawn, the whiskey his only companion. It was on one such night that the wind howled with a particular fury, rattling the window panes and moaning down the chimney like a grieving woman. The house groaned around him, a great wooden ship on a stormy sea. Sleep was an impossibility. Restless, he rose from his chair and began to pace, the floorboards creaking under his weight. His path took him down the main hall and past the narrow staircase that led to the attic servants' quarters. As he passed, he heard something. It wasn't the wind. It was a sound from within the house, soft and rhythmic. A human sound. A voice. It was so faint he thought he might have imagined it. A trick of the wind and the whiskey. He stopped, holding his breath, listening. There it was again. A murmur, a whisper, coming from above, from her room. Curiosity, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, pricked at him. He was the master of this house. No secrets were to be kept from him. Yet it felt like an intrusion, a violation of the quiet space she so carefully maintained around herself. He hesitated, his hand on the newel post. The wind shrieked, and in the brief lull that followed, he heard it again, a little clearer this time. A sob, so quiet and choked it was barely a sound at all. Something pulled him up those stairs. It wasn't the authority of a master. It was a deeper, more human instinct. He moved as silently as a hunter, his stockinged feet making no sound on the wooden steps. The attic was cold, the wind finding its way through the eaves. A thin line of candlelight shone from beneath the door of the last room on the right. Her room. He stood before the simple plank door, a man frozen between 2 worlds, the world of his own grief and the world of a sorrow he did not understand. He shouldn't be here. He should turn around, go back to his fire and his whiskey, and leave the girl to her private demons. But he couldn't. He leaned closer, his ear pressed against the rough wood, feeling the faint vibrations of her voice.
I will. Papa, I promise I will,
she whispered. Her voice was raw with unshed tears.
I'm being good. I'm working hard. Mrs.
Henderson says I'm a good worker. There was a pause, filled only by the sound of a shuddering breath. It's so big here, so empty. The wind, it never stops. Sometimes I think it's calling my name. Or yours. She gave a small, heartbreaking laugh that was more of a gasp. No one knows. No one will ever know. Mr. Rollins, he's a hard man. He doesn't see me. It's better that way. Safer. Ethan's jaw tightened. Asterisk. He doesn't see me. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow, because it was true. He had deliberately not seen her. She was a fixture, a piece of furniture, and yet she had seen him. She had seen his cold, his exhaustion, and had left him a blanket and a warm drink. Her whispers continued, fragmented and desperate, a prayer to a ghost. I just have to save enough, just enough to get away. Somewhere he can't ever find me. He won't get his hands on me again. I'd rather die out here, in the snow, than let him. Her voice broke, devolving into a series of soft, muffled sobs. I'm so tired, Papa, but I won't give up. I made you a promise. I will survive. Ethan pushed himself away from the door as if it were burning hot. He retreated down the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt like a trespasser, a thief who had stolen something deeply personal and sacred. He had heard the raw, unvarnished truth of her existence. She was not just a quiet girl from Ohio. She was a fugitive. She was running from a past so terrible she would rather face the merciless Wyoming winter than return to it. Her quietness wasn't shyness. It was a shield. Her solitude wasn't a preference. It was a fortress. He returned to the great room, the fire now seeming inadequate against a new kind of chill that had settled deep within him. He poured another whiskey, but this time, the spirit offered no comfort. He looked at the empty chair where Sarah had sat, and for the first time, he didn't just see the woman he had lost. He saw the girl upstairs, alone in the dark, clinging to a promise made to a dead man. He had believed himself to be the most solitary soul in this house, the undisputed king of a lonely kingdom. But tonight, he had heard the truth. There was another heart beating in the darkness, a heart just as broken as his own, yet one that still fought with a fierce and desperate will. The wind howled its mournful song, but Ethan no longer heard it as a curse. He heard it as a lament, a song for the lost and the lonely, a song for the ghosts in his house, both the dead and the living. He looked into the flames, and this time, he did not see the faces of his past. He saw a pair of stormy gray eyes, filled with a sorrow he now understood, and a strength he had never imagined. A flicker of something unknown, something that was not pity or curiosity, stirred in the frozen depths of his soul. It was a fragile, dangerous thing. That flicker, it was the first sign of a thaw. The knowledge of Abigail's secret life changed the very air in the house. It was no longer a simple structure of wood and stone filled with his own echoing grief. It was now a vessel holding two solitary worlds, orbiting each other in a silent, gravitational dance. Ethan found himself watching her, not with the detached gaze of a master, but with the focused intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle. He had heard the words, but he now sought the story behind them. His world had been one of broad, brutal strokes: the calving season, the winter feed, the price of beef in Cheyenne, the unending ache of loss. Abigail's world, he was discovering, was painted in miniatures. It was in the way she mended a tear in the dining room curtains with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, a patient artistry that went far beyond her duties. It was in the sprig of pine she tucked behind a picture frame in the hall, a small, quiet rebellion of life against the house's sterile gloom. He started to see a pattern in her unobtrusive acts of care. He'd come in from a day of mending fences in the north pasture, his shoulders screaming with a familiar ache from an old injury. He'd slump into his chair, too tired to even pull off his boots, and when he woke an hour later from a fitful doze, a small poultice of comfrey and wintergreen would be resting on the table beside him, its sharp, medicinal scent cutting through the air. There was never a note, never a word. It was simply there, as if the house itself had offered it. But he knew. He began to test the boundaries of this silent communication. One evening, feigning a cough, He complained aloud to the empty room about the dry, smoky air. The next morning, a small kettle of water sat simmering on the hearth, a few fragrant herbs floating on its surface, humidifying the air with the scent of mint and eucalyptus. He was a man accustomed to giving orders and having them followed. This was something else entirely. This was anticipation. This was empathy, and it unnerved him as much as it soothed him. His internal landscape, once a frozen tundra, began to show signs of a reluctant thaw. He would find himself thinking of her at odd moments, out on the range, staring at the vast, indifferent sky. He would wonder what she was running from. Who was this? She spoke of with such terror in her whispered pleas. The questions were hooks that snagged in his mind, pulling him away from the safe numbness of his work. This new awareness brought with it a fierce, protective instinct he hadn't felt since Thomas was a toddler. Taking his first stumbling steps, he found himself subtly altering the household dynamics. He gave Mrs. Henderson a curt order that Abigail's duties were to be confined to the main house, sparing her the heavier work in the kitchens and laundry. He invented reasons. The dust in the library bothers my throat. Miss Thorne seems more thorough, he'd grumbled, avoiding the housekeeper's shrewd, knowing gaze. He was building a wall around Abigail, not to keep her in, but to keep the harshness of the world out. He was protecting the one small, warm thing in his cold life. This growing obsession led him to a new, strangely intimate ritual. His sleepless nights by the fire continued, but they were no longer spent in a whiskey-fueled stupor. Now, they were filled with waiting. He would come into the great room late, after the house had fallen silent, and sink into his large leather armchair, pulling the wool blanket her blanket. As he now thought of it over his lap, he would close his eyes, slow his breathing, and feign sleep. It was a deception born of a desperate need to get closer to the truth of her without shattering the fragile, unspoken peace between them. To speak to her of what he'd heard would be to frighten her away, to send her running back into the wilderness he knew she feared. So he waited in his false sleep, a silent sentinel in the dark. Usually, she would come an hour or so after Mrs. Henderson had retired. He learned the sounds of her approach, the soft creak of the third step on the main staircase, the whisper of her worn slippers on the rug in the hall. She would pause at the threshold, and he could feel her presence, her hesitation. He imagined her standing there, a slim silhouette against the dim moonlight from the hall window, checking to see if he was truly asleep. The first time she entered while he was sleeping, his heart had hammered so violently he was sure she could hear it. She moved to the fireplace, her movements economical and silent. He heard the soft scrape of the iron poker against the stone, the gentle thump of a new log settling onto the glowing embers. Then, the soft, rhythmic puffing of the bellows, coaxing the flames back to life. A wave of warmth washed out from the hearth, a physical manifestation of her care. She didn't leave right away. He heard her sigh, a sound so laden with weariness it felt like a physical weight in the room. He pictured her standing there, her shoulders slumped, her guard down for just a moment in the presence of a sleeping man. In that sound, he heard the echo of her whispered fears, the burden of her promises. It was the most honest sound he had heard in 3 years. This became his secret communion. Night after night, he would wait for her. He learned the cadence of her quiet work, the gentle rhythm of her presence. Sometimes, after tending the fire, she would move through the room, straightening a book on a shelf, or picking a stray piece of lint from the rug. Tiny acts of order against the chaos of the world. He was a statue in his chair, a silent observer to these quiet rituals that were slowly, inexorably, breathing life back into the dead heart of his home. One night, the wind was particularly vicious, clawing at the house with an almost sentient rage. He had spent the day in a foul mood, a dispute with a neighboring rancher over water rights leaving him raw and angry. He sat in his chair, the anger a cold, hard knot in his stomach, and waited. She was later than usual. When she finally came, her movements seemed slower, more tired. She tended the fire, and the new flames cast dancing shadows on the walls. He felt her move closer to his chair. He kept his breathing deep and even, his eyes shut tight. He felt a slight shift in the air and realized she had bent down. He smelled the faint, clean scent of lye soap and something else, something uniquely her, like dried wildflowers and fresh linen. Her fingers, light as a moth's wing, brushed against the blanket, tucking it more securely around his shoulders. The touch was accidental, fleeting, and yet it sent a jolt through him that was more powerful than any shot of whiskey. It was a simple, human touch, devoid of demand or expectation. It was pure, unadulterated kindness. His carefully constructed walls of grief and anger crumbled in that instant. The ice around his heart didn't just crack, it shattered. A sudden, sharp longing pierced him, a desire so intense it was painful, a longing to open his eyes, to see her face in the firelight, to tell her, what? That he knew that she wasn't alone, that this house was no longer just his tomb, but could be her sanctuary. But he didn't move. He couldn't. The fear was a cold hand gripping his throat. The last time he had allowed himself to feel this way? To love. It had ended in a frozen hillside under a cottonwood tree. Love was a prelude to loss. Hope was the cruelest lie the world could tell. To open his heart to this girl would be to invite that pain back in, to give fate another target. He had built his fortress of solitude for a reason. It was safe. It was empty, but it was safe. She lingered for a moment longer. Then her soft footsteps retreated, leaving him alone with the fire she had stoked and the turmoil she had ignited within him. He opened his eyes, staring into the bright, crackling flames. The fire had always been his companion in grief. Now, it felt like something more. It was no longer just a reminder of the warmth he had lost. It was a symbol of what he had just felt. The flames danced and leaped, a vibrant, living thing in the darkness. She had kept this fire alive, just as she was keeping herself alive, through sheer, stubborn will. In its light, Ethan Rollins saw the terrifying, undeniable truth. A tiny, dangerous seed of hope had been planted in the barren ground of his soul, and he knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified him, that it had already begun to grow. The bitter cold of the Wyoming winter had a way of finding the weakest point in any defense. For the strong, it was a challenge. For the weary, it was a predator. Abigail Thorne. Fueled by a quiet desperation and the promises she whispered into the dark, had been running on fumes for months. The hard labor, the scant hours of sleep, and the constant, gnawing anxiety had worn her down, leaving her with a spirit of iron but a body of glass. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. A brutal wind had deposited a fresh drift of snow against the north side of the house, and Abigail, along with another maid, had been tasked with clearing a path to the woodpile. For hours. She worked in the biting cold, her thin coat an inadequate shield, her breaths pluming in the frigid air. She refused to stop, refused to admit the deep, aching chill that had settled in her bones. To stop was to be weak, and weakness was a luxury she could not afford. It was Mrs. Henderson who found her, the housekeeper, a woman whose heart was more practical than soft, but whose eyes missed nothing, noticed Abigail's absence at the midday meal. A quick search led her to the small attic room, where Abigail lay on her narrow cot, still in her damp work clothes, shivering violently beneath a single thin blanket. Her face was flushed with fever, her skin alarmingly hot to the touch. Mrs. Henderson's face, usually a mask of stern efficiency, tightened with concern. She went directly to Ethan's study. He was hunched over his ledgers, the numbers a familiar, orderly world he could control. "Mr. Rollins," she said, her voice clipped, dispensing with pleasantries. It's the Thorn girl. She's taken ill. A bad fever. Ethan looked up, his gray eyes cold and distant. For a moment, he was the master of the house, annoyed by the disruption. His first instinct was to issue an order. Have one of the other girls look after her. Send for the doctor if you must. I've already sent one of the ranch hands for Dr. Miller. Sir, but it's a bad chill. She's burning up. Mrs. Henderson paused, her gaze steady. She had been with his family for 20 years. She had held him as a boy when he'd fallen from a horse, and she had stood beside him at Sarah's grave. She knew the man behind the stone facade. She's a wisp of a thing, sir. She pushes herself too hard. Something in her tone, a quiet undercurrent of meaning, broke through his carefully constructed wall of indifference. This was not just a report on a sick servant. This was an appeal. He thought of her in the dark, whispering her vows of survival. I'm so tired, Papa. He pushed the ledger away, the neat columns of figures suddenly meaningless. The knot of anger and grief he carried in his chest tightened, but it was pierced by a new, sharp emotion, fear. A raw, terrifying fear that this small light, this tiny ember of warmth he had been secretly nurturing, was about to be extinguished. I'll see to her, he said, his voice a low growl. He rose from his chair, his tall frame seeming to fill the room, and strode past the astonished housekeeper without another word. He took the attic stairs 2 at a time. The air grew colder as he ascended, the contrast with the warmth of the main house stark. Her room was at the far end of the narrow hall, a space little bigger than a closet. The door was ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside, and the world seemed to shrink around him. The room was painfully bare. A narrow cot, a small wooden crate for a table with a wash basin and a pitcher, and a single candle stub. Her few belongings were contained in a small, worn carpet bag tucked under the bed. The wind moaned through a crack in the window pane, a mournful, lonely sound. This was the fortress she had built for herself, and it was as cold and spare as a prison cell. She was curled on her side, a tremor running through her small frame. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her hair, usually pinned back so severely, had come loose, framing her flushed face in soft brown waves. In the grip of the fever, the careful mask she wore for the world had fallen away, leaving her looking impossibly young and vulnerable. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway behind him, her arms laden with fresh linens and a bowl of cool water. Sir, she began, her voice uncertain. Leave it, Ethan commanded, his voice softer than he intended. He didn't turn to look at her. His gaze was fixed on the girl on the cot. Go. I'll handle this. The housekeeper hesitated for only a second. She saw the set of his jaw, the fierce, protective light in his eyes. She had seen that look before, years ago, when his son Thomas had come down with a croupy cough. Without a word, she placed the items just inside the door and retreated, pulling the door quietly shut behind her. He was alone with her. For a long moment, he just stood there, a giant in a doll's room, feeling clumsy and useless. He was a man who could break a horse, command a dozen men, and bend the will of the land itself. But faced with this fragile, shivering girl, he was lost. Then, instinct took over. The same instinct that had guided him through blizzards and cattle drives, the instinct to protect and preserve. He moved to the cot and knelt beside it, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Gently, he began to unlace her wet, mud-caked boots. He pulled them off, his large hands surprisingly deft, and set them aside. Her woolen stockings were damp and cold. He peeled them away, revealing small, pale feet, blue with chill. He took the fresh linens Mrs. Henderson had left and dipped a cloth in the cool water. He hesitated, the cloth hovering over her forehead. This was a line he had never crossed. His interactions with her had been a phantom dance of gestures and observations. To touch her now felt like a profound and irrevocable act. He pressed the cool cloth to her forehead. Her skin was like fire. She flinched at the contact but didn't wake, letting out a low moan. The sound twisted something in his gut. He smoothed the damp cloth over her brow, pushing back the stray strands of her hair. Her skin was soft, delicate, a stark contrast to his own calloused and weathered hands. He felt a tremor pass from her to him, a current of shared vulnerability. He worked in a silent, focused rhythm. He fetched more blankets from a downstairs closet, piling them on top of her. He went to the kitchen and returned with a broth Mrs. Henderson had left simmering on the stove. He sat on the floor beside her cot, a position of utter surrender, and waited. Hours passed. The light outside the small window faded from gray to indigo. He sat in the growing dark, listening to the sound of her ragged breathing and the lonely cry of the wind. He did not think of his work, of his ledgers, of his loss. His entire world had contracted to this small, cold room and the feverish girl in the bed. Sometime deep in the night, she began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with fever and confusion at first, struggling to focus in the dim candlelight. Then they found him. They widened, not with recognition, but with sheer animal terror.
No,
she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She tried to push herself up, to scramble away, her movements frantic and weak.
Please, don't.
The terror in her voice was not for him. Ethan Rollins, her employer, it was for the other man. The ghost from her past she whispered to in the dark, in her delirium. The two had merged. Abigail, he said, his voice low and calm, trying to cut through the fog of her fever. It's me, it's Ethan, you're safe. He reached out, intending to gently press her back onto the pillow, but as his hand touched her shoulder, she flinched so violently it was as if he had struck her. The shame of what he had overheard, of his nightly deceptions, washed over him. He was no better than the man she feared, a man who lurked in the shadows and listened to her secrets. But then, as her panicked gaze met his, the delirium seemed to recede. The fear remained, but it changed. A new horror dawned in her eyes, the horror of recognition, of shame. "Mr. Rollins," she breathed, the name a painful gasp. Her flushed face paled. She looked from his face to his hand on her shoulder, to the blankets piled over her, and a mortifying understanding flooded her features. He had been here. He had been caring for her. How much had she said in her fevered state? Had she cried out for her father? Had she spoken of her fears? "You heard," she whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of utter defeat. "You heard me." She thought of all the nights she had stood by the fire, whispering her heart into the darkness, believing him to be asleep. The shame was a physical blow, so powerful it seemed to drive the very air from her lungs. She was exposed, her carefully guarded world shattered. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. She wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Ethan's heart ached with a pain that was sharp and new. He saw her shame, her fear of his judgment. He saw her bracing for the scorn, the dismissal, the casting out that she surely believed was coming. He slowly withdrew his hand from her shoulder. He sat back on his heels, giving her space. He had to choose his words with the care of a man disarming a bomb. "Abigail," he began again, his voice rough with emotion. "I heard a woman who was cold and sick. I heard a woman who has fought harder than anyone I've ever known." He leaned forward slightly, forcing her to open her eyes and meet his gaze. "There is no shame in this room. Do you understand me? There is no shame here." Her gray eyes, now clear and lucid, searched his face, looking for the lie, the pity, the contempt. She found none. She saw only a raw, unguarded sincerity. She saw a deep, resonant sorrow that mirrored her own. He reached out again, slowly this time, his movements deliberate. He didn't touch her face or her shoulder. He simply laid his large, warm hand over her small, trembling one where it rested on the blanket. It was the first time they had truly touched, skin to skin, conscious and aware. Her hand was lost in his. His was rough and calloused from a life of hard labor. Hers was chapped and scarred in its own right, but it felt impossibly fragile. It was not the touch of a master to a servant. It was the touch of a drowning man finding a piece of driftwood, of a frozen man finding a flame. It was a silent, solemn vow. In that touch, Abigail felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not charity. It was a powerful, grounding current of safety, a sense of being anchored in a storm. The strength she had guarded so fiercely, the strength to stand alone, finally gave way to a different kind of courage, the courage to let someone else in. The fight went out of her. The tension in her shoulders eased, and the tears that followed were no longer of shame, but of a profound, soul-deep relief. She didn't pull her hand away. She simply let it rest in his, a quiet surrender that was the bravest thing she had ever done. And Ethan Rollins, the man who had closed his heart to the world, did not let go. He held on, as if he were holding the last light in the world. The days following Abigail's fever were marked by a fragile, unspoken truce. The rigid lines between master and servant had blurred, replaced by a quiet awareness that hummed in the air between them. Ethan found himself making excuses to be in the main house, lingering over his coffee in the morning, watching her as she moved through the room, dusting a table or tending the fire. She, in turn, no longer flinched when he entered a room. She would meet his gaze for a fleeting second, a flicker of understanding in her gray eyes, before lowering her head and continuing her work. A silent conversation was taking place, a language of shared glances and small gestures that was more intimate than any words they could have spoken. The West, however, has little patience for such delicate things. It is a land of extremes, and the fragile peace of the house was about to be shattered by the full fury of a Wyoming blizzard. The day began with a deceptive calm. The sky was a high, pale gray, the color of old pewter, and the air was unnervously still. The cattle were restless, bunching together in the low-lying pastures, their breath pluming in the unnaturally cold air. The older ranch hands sniffed the wind and cast worried glances at the sky. They knew this stillness. It was the deep breath a predator takes before it strikes. A report came in from one of the outriders. A section of fence in the treacherous western canyon had been brought down by a rock slide, and a small herd of pregnant heifers had wandered through the gap, heading toward the unforgiving high country. Losing them would be a significant financial blow. But more than that, leaving them to the mercy of the coming storm was unthinkable. "I'll go," Ethan said, pulling on his heavy sheepskin coat. "Jed, you and the boys round up the rest of the herd and get them into the main barn. Don't wait for me." His foreman, Jed, a man with a face like a roadmap of every hard winter for the last 50 years, shook his head. "It's a fool's errand. Ethan, that storm's gonna hit before noon. Those heifers are already lost." "No animal on my land is lost until I say it is," Ethan replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. He strapped on his gun belt, a habit as natural as breathing, and headed for the stables. Abigail was in the main hall, polishing the brass handles on the great oak door. As he passed, he paused, an unfamiliar hesitation stopping him. He wanted to say something. Asterisk, be careful. Don't work too hard. Wait for me. But the words were foreign, stuck in his throat. Instead, he just met her eyes. She saw the set of his jaw, the grim determination in his face. She knew, with a woman's intuition, that this was more than a simple chore. Her polishing cloth stilled in her hand.
"The sky looks angry. Mr. Rollins,"
she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's been angry before," he said, pulling on his gloves. He gave her a curt nod and was gone, the heavy door closing behind him with a final thud. The first flakes began to fall an hour later, They were small and sparse at first, drifting lazily from the pewter sky, but within minutes, the wind began to rise, and the lazy flakes turned into a thick, swirling curtain of white. The world dissolved, the horizon vanished, the mountains, the trees, the very land itself was erased, leaving only the screaming wind and the blinding, suffocating snow. Inside the ranch house, a tense quiet fell. The ranch hands worked with grim efficiency, their voices lost in the roar of the blizzard. Mrs. Henderson ordered the storm shutters bolted and extra logs brought in for the fireplaces. Abigail worked alongside the others, her hands busy but her mind 1,000 miles away, in a western canyon with a man who had looked at her as if he were leaving a part of himself behind. By late afternoon, the storm was a living monster. The wind howled like a banshee, shaking the very foundations of the house. Snow piled in great drifts against the windows, plunging the rooms into a premature twilight. Ethan had not returned. Jed stood by the window in the great room, peering into the maelstrom, his face etched with worry. "He's not coming back tonight," he said to Mrs. Henderson, his voice low. "No man could ride in this. We'll be lucky if we can find him come morning." Abigail stood near the hearth, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. She heard Jed's words, and a primal fear, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced through her. She thought of Ethan's face, of his hand covering hers, of the promise of safety she had felt in his touch. The thought of him out there, alone, freezing, was more than she could bear. It was a pain that dwarfed her own old fears, a terror that demanded action. While the others resigned themselves to waiting, a desperate plan formed in her mind. She knew the ranch, in her quiet, solitary way. She had explored it, learned its paths and landmarks. She knew of an old line shack in the foothills, not far from the western canyon. It was little more than a hovel, but it would have a stove and a small supply of wood. It was a chance. Slipping away unnoticed, she went not to her room, but to Ethan's. She pulled one of his discarded oilskin coats from a hook. It was huge on her, but it was thick and waterproof. She found a pair of his thickest wool gloves and a fur-lined hat. Then she went to the pantry and filled a small sack with a flask of whiskey, a block of cheese, and some dried beef. Finally, she took a storm lantern from the hall, her hands trembling as she lit the wick. She left through the kitchen, a ghost slipping out into a world of white chaos. The moment she stepped outside, the storm hit her with the force of a physical blow. The wind tore the breath from her lungs, and the lantern light was a pathetic, flickering glow, illuminating nothing but the swirling vortex of snow directly in front of her. She nearly turned back, her own survival instinct screaming at her to seek the safety of the house. But then she saw his face again in her mind's eye, and she pushed forward, her small frame bent against the relentless wind. It was an act of sheer, desperate faith. She couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of her. She navigated by memory and instinct, keeping what she prayed was the stable wall to her right. She found his horse first, huddled against a rock outcropping, its coat thick with ice. But Ethan was gone. She screamed his name, the sound instantly ripped from her lips and swallowed by the storm. Panic began to set in, but she fought it down. Asterisk. He wouldn't just lie down, asterisk? She thought. He'd seek shelter. She thought of the line shack. She stumbled on, her legs burning with cold and effort, her face numb. She fell a dozen times, the snow a soft, cold trap, every time. She forced herself back up, driven by a will that was no longer entirely her own. She found him by sheer, dumb luck, a dark shape against the endless white, slumped at the base of a tall pine, no more than 100 yards from the shack he had been trying to reach. He was half buried in a drift, his horse's reins still clutched in his frozen hand. "Ethan!" she screamed, scrambling toward him. He was barely conscious. His skin was a deathly white, his lips blue. A layer of ice coated his eyebrows and beard. He stirred when she touched him, his eyes opening to slits, but there was no recognition in them. "Cold," he mumbled, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. She half dragged, half carried him the remaining distance to the shack. The door was frozen shut, and she had to throw her entire weight against it several times before it burst open. Inside, it was as cold as a tomb, with fumbling, frozen fingers. She managed to light the kindling in the small pot-bellied stove, her own hands so numb she could barely feel the matches. The fire caught, a tiny, sputtering flame of hope in the icy darkness. She turned back to Ethan. He was a dead weight on the floor, his shivers growing weaker, a dangerous sign. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the fire wouldn't be enough. It would take too long to heat the small cabin, and he didn't have that long. She had heard stories from the old-timers about bringing a man back from the brink of freezing. There was only one way. With a desperate resolve, she began to pull off his frozen, ice-caked coat. His shirt beneath was stiff with frost. Her own clothes were wet and clinging to her skin. Necessity, raw and brutal, stripped away all thought of propriety, of master and servant, of shame and fear. There was only life and death. She worked frantically, her numb fingers clumsy on the buttons and buckles. She stripped away his wet outer layers and her own until they were both down to their thin undergarments, their skin shocking and cold in the frigid air. She dragged him close to the fledgling fire and pulled the single dusty blanket from the cot over both of them. She pressed her body against his, her arms wrapping around his broad chest, her legs tangling with his. He was like a block of ice. His shivering was violent at first, his whole body shaking against hers. She held on tighter, trying to force the warmth from her own body into his, a desperate, living sacrifice. He was delirious, mumbling words she couldn't understand. His head lolled, his face pressing into the curve of her neck. He was so close, his cold breath on her skin. His hard, shivering body a terrifying and intimate presence. The situation was so extreme, so far beyond the realm of her experience, that it triggered something deep within her, a ghost from the past she thought she had buried. The feeling of being trapped, of a man's overwhelming presence, brought a surge of old panic.
"Don't tell my father,"
she whispered, the words torn from her, a reflexive plea from a younger, more terrified version of herself. Her voice was a trembling, broken thing in the roaring silence of the storm. The sound of her voice seemed to cut through his frozen delirium. He stilled for a moment, his shivering subsiding. He wasn't the monster from her past. He was Ethan. He shifted, his powerful arms coming around her, pulling her even closer, not with force, but with a desperate, instinctual need for the life she was offering. A low sound, a moan of both agony and profound relief, escaped his lips. He held her tightly, as if she were the only anchor in a world that had come apart. In that moment, hovering between life and death, everything fell away. He wasn't the rich cowboy, and she wasn't the maid. They were just a man and a woman, stripped bare, clinging to each other for survival. But as the minutes stretched into hours, and the slow, life-giving warmth began to pass between them, survival began to transform into something else. The frantic, beating pulse of her heart against his ribs was the most profound thing he had ever felt. The scent of her hair, the soft, shocking warmth of her skin, the gentle curve of her back under his hands, it all became a prayer. He had been a ghost in a dead house, and this woman, this slip of a girl with the courage of a lioness, had walked into a blizzard to bring him back to life. He knew, with a clarity that burned brighter than the storm outside, that he would never let her go. He had found his reason to live again, here in this frozen shack, in the arms of his savior. He had chosen her, forever. They lay like that through the long, dark night, a single knot of shared life against the howling fury of the storm. The fire in the stove burned low, but the fire between them burned brighter. A desperate, defiant flame of survival, and of a love born in the very heart of the ice. The world returned in shades of white and blue, The wind died first, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt louder than the storm itself. Then the sun, a pale, watery disk, broke through the clouds, scattering 1,000,000,000 diamonds across the snow-covered plains. It was into this new, clean world that Jed and the rescue party found them. They didn't find a master and a servant. They found a man and a woman huddled together under a single blanket, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes holding the same exhausted, hollowed-out look of soldiers after a battle. When Jed pushed open the door of the line shack, Ethan looked up, his arm tightening instinctively around Abigail. There was a look in his eyes that Jed had never seen before, a fierce, possessive fire that warned the world away. No words were needed. Everything had changed. The ride back to the ranch was a slow, solemn procession through the deep snow. Abigail rode in front of Ethan on his horse, wrapped in a thick buffalo robe, her back pressed against his chest. He held the reins with one hand and kept the other firmly around her waist, a silent, public declaration. A current of warmth passed between them, a shield against the cold air and the curious, speculative glances of the ranch hands. Back at the house, a new kind of silence descended. Mrs. Henderson, her face an unreadable mask, took one look at them and immediately set about preparing hot baths and broth. Her movements brisk and efficient. But her sharp eyes missed nothing the way Ethan refused to let Abigail go until she was safely inside. The lingering touch of his hand on her arm. The way Abigail, instead of scurrying away in fear, met his gaze with a look of profound, shared intimacy. The carefully ordered world of the Rollins Ranch had been upended, not by the blizzard, but by what had happened within it. In the weeks that followed, as the great thaw began, the house came alive in a way it hadn't since Sarah's time. It was a gradual, quiet spring, both outside and in. The Chinook winds came, warm and soft, and began to eat away at the massive drifts of snow. The sound of melting ice, a steady drip and trickle, replaced the howl of the wind. Patches of brown earth appeared. Then the first improbable green shoots of crocuses pushing their way toward the sun. The land was breathing again. So was Ethan. The change in him was astonishing. The granite mask was gone, replaced by a softer, more watchful expression. The ghost that had haunted the halls was replaced by a man who was present, his steps sure and purposeful. He no longer sought the solitary company of his whiskey bottle by the fire. Instead, he sought her. He would find her in the library, her fingers tracing the leather bindings of his books, and he would talk to her about them. His voice, once used only for curt commands, now sharing stories of his father, who had loved poetry. He would come into the kitchen while she was kneading bread, and he would stay, leaning against the doorframe, simply to be in her presence, asking her quiet questions about Ohio, about the trees and the rivers there, carefully avoiding the shadows he knew lurked behind her memories. For Abigail, it was like learning to breathe after years of holding her breath. The constant, crushing weight of fear began to lift. In Ethan's presence, she felt a sense of safety that was so complete, so absolute. It was intoxicating. The shame of what he knew about her past was slowly replaced by the wonder that he knew it, and yet looked at her not with pity, but with a reverence that made her feel cherished. Her own quiet nature blossomed in the warmth of his attention. A small smile would touch her lips when he entered a room. The stormy gray of her eyes softened into the gentle color of a spring rain. But spring melts more than just snow. As the roads became passable, the story of Ethan Rollins's ordeal and his miraculous rescue spread, and like a river swollen with meltwater, the story changed its course, gathering dirt and debris as it went. In the small town of Laramie and on the neighboring ranches, the tale was told and retold, each telling embroidered with speculation and insinuation. It was no longer a story of survival. It was a scandal. The wealthy, reclusive Ethan Rollins who had mourned his wife with such grim finality, had been saved by his serving girl. They had been alone, trapped for a night. The whispers started in the saloons and general stores, passed between men over cards and women over quilting frames. What had really happened in that shack? The girl was young, plain, a nobody from back east. It was obvious what she was after. Abigail felt the change first. It was a cold draft in a warm room. The other maids, who had once been guardedly friendly, now fell silent when she entered a room, their eyes holding a new, unpleasant curiosity. When she accompanied Mrs. Henderson into town for supplies, she felt the stares. They were like physical things, sharp and pointed, pricking at her skin. Women who had once given her a polite nod now looked through her, their lips pursed in disapproval. One afternoon, standing at the counter of the general store, she heard it herself. Two women, wives of prominent ranchers, stood a few feet away, pretending to inspect a bolt of calico. Their voices were pitched to a stage whisper, deliberately meant to be overheard. Shameless is what it is, playing the hero to get her hooks into him. Well, you can't blame her for trying. A fortune like that. It's a pity he's so blinded by grief. He can't see he's being played like a fiddle. Poor Sarah Rollins must be turning in her grave. Each word was a slap. Abigail stood frozen, her face burning with a shame so hot it brought tears to her eyes. She felt the old, familiar terror creeping back in, the feeling of being judged, of being powerless, of being seen as something dirty. She fumbled with her packages and fled the store, her heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She ran from the town, but she couldn't run from the truth of their words. In their eyes, she was a gold digger, a schemer who had used a man's vulnerability to her own advantage. It didn't matter that her only thought had been to save his life. The world would only ever see the rich man and the poor girl, and it would always draw the ugliest conclusion. The joy that had begun to bloom in her heart withered and died, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She began to see herself through their eyes. She was a stain on Ethan's name, a source of gossip and ridicule. The love and safety she had found in his arms now seemed like a foolish dream, a beautiful, fragile thing that could not survive in the harsh light of the world. She started to pull away from him. She made herself scarce, burying herself in work in the farthest corners of the house. When he sought her out, she would answer his questions with a quiet yes, sir, or no, sir, resurrecting the wall that he had so patiently torn down. She could not bear to see the love in his eyes, because she now believed that love would be his ruin. Ethan was not a fool. He felt her retreat immediately. The light that had returned to her eyes was dimming, replaced by the old, familiar shadow of fear. The easy warmth between them was replaced by a strained, painful silence. He saw the whispers of the other servants, the cold shoulder she received from Mrs. Henderson, who, for all her practicality, was a stickler for social order. He knew what was happening. He had spent his life in this world. He knew its harsh, unforgiving codes. He had just forgotten them, for a little while. In the private spring he and Abigail had created. One evening, he found her in the great room. Long after the others had gone to bed, she was standing by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around herself, a solitary, forlorn figure. He came and stood beside her, the silence stretching between them. "They're talking, aren't they?" he said finally, his voice low. It wasn't a question. She flinched but didn't look at him. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the gray ashes in the fireplace. "What they say doesn't matter," he said, his voice hard. "It's the buzzing of flies. It means nothing." "It matters to you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It's your name, your reputation. I'm bringing shame to this house, to you." "Shame." He turned, his hand closing gently over her arm, forcing her to face him. "You think you bring me shame, Abigail? Look at me. He waited until her tear-filled eyes met his. This house was a tomb before you came here. I was a dead man walking. I had a fortune, I had land, and I had nothing. You walked into a blizzard for me. You breathed life back into me. That is not shame. That is honor. That is everything. The raw emotion in his voice, the fierce sincerity in his eyes, was almost her undoing. She wanted to believe him, to throw herself into his arms and let him be her shield. But the voices of the town were louder, cruel and insistent. "I can't," she sobbed, pulling away from him. "I can't be the reason they mock you. I can't be the woman they whisper about. I won't do that to you." She turned and fled, her footsteps echoing up the grand staircase, leaving him alone in the silent, cavernous room. He stared after her, a cold, hard anger solidifying in his chest. It was an anger directed not at her, but at the small-minded, petty world that sought to tear them apart. He had lost everything once to the cruel indifference of fate. He would not lose this. He would not lose her. Not to whispers. Not to rumors. Not to the whole damn judgmental world. The spring had come, and with it, the weeds of prejudice and envy. He would not let them choke out the one beautiful thing that had taken root in his desolate life. He would burn them all to the ground first. The annual Miller Barn Dance was the social event of the season, a rare opportunity for far-flung neighbors to gather, trade gossip, and forget the hardships of the land for a single night of fiddle music and laughter. For weeks, the prospect of it had been a source of anxious dread for Abigail. She had assumed, with a sense of relief, that Ethan would never consider going. It was a public affair, and they had become a private, fragile world of their own. She was wrong. 2 days before the dance, he found her in the garden, tending the new spring herbs. He stood before her, his tall frame blocking the afternoon sun, his expression resolute. "Abigail," he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation, "we're going to the Miller's dance on Saturday." Her trowel fell from her hand, clattering against a stone. She looked up at him, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat of fear. "No," she whispered. "Mr. Rollins, we can't. You know what they'll say, what they'll think." "I know exactly what they'll say," he replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "and I want them to say it to my face. We are done hiding. I am done letting them frighten you." He knelt before her, taking her dirt-smudged hands in his. His grip was warm and firm. "I will not have you living in the shadows of this house like a secret. You are not a secret. You are the light in it. Now, go and find yourself a dress." The dress was one of Sarah's, Mrs. Henderson. Her face, a complicated mixture of disapproval and grudging respect, had brought it to her room. It was simple, made of deep blue calico that matched Abigail's eyes, and when she put it on, it fit as if it were made for her. Staring at her reflection in the small, warped mirror, she saw not a servant girl, but a woman loved by Ethan Rollins. The thought was still so new, so staggering, that it made her feel dizzy, but the fear remained, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. When she descended the staircase on Saturday evening, Ethan was waiting for her at the bottom. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a dark coat and string tie, his boots polished to a high shine. When he saw her, he stopped breathing for a second. The look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated reverence. He walked to her and took her hand, raising it to his lips. "Abigail," he breathed, his gaze holding hers. "You are beautiful." In that moment, she felt a surge of courage. With his hand in hers, she felt she could face anything. Their arrival at the Miller barn was like a stone dropped into a still pond. The big double doors were thrown open, spilling golden lantern light and the lively sound of a fiddle onto the dusty yard. But as Ethan helped Abigail down from the buggy, a wave of silence rippled out from the entrance. The music faltered. The laughter died. 100 pairs of eyes turned to stare. They saw Ethan Rollins, the wealthy recluse, back from the dead, and on his arm, they saw his little brown wren of a serving girl, dressed in his dead wife's clothes. The whispers started instantly, a sibilant, ugly sound, like snakes rustling in dry grass. Abigail's courage evaporated. She wanted to shrink, to run, to become invisible. She felt the color drain from her face, and her hand trembled in Ethan's. He felt it and squeezed her fingers, his grip a warm, reassuring anchor. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at her. "Don't listen to them," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "Tonight, there is no one in this world but you and me." He led her through the parting sea of onlookers, his head held high, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with a cold, challenging glare that dared anyone to speak aloud. They found a space near the wall, and the music, after an awkward pause, started up again, a little less joyful than before. The party resumed, but the atmosphere was changed. It was charged with tension, every eye covertly watching the strange couple in the corner. For several long, agonizing minutes, they simply stood there. Abigail felt trapped, a specimen under glass. Then the fiddle player struck up a slow, sweet waltz. Ethan turned to her, a small smile playing on his lips. "May I have this dance, Miss Thorne?" he asked, his voice formal, yet his eyes danced with a private, intimate light. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He led her onto the rough-planked dance floor. He placed one hand firmly on the small of her back and took her other hand in his. As he drew her close, the scent of pine and clean linen and the sheer, solid warmth of him enveloped her. He was her shield. He was her home. He began to lead her in the simple steps of the waltz. They moved together, a solitary island of grace in a sea of judgment. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Abigail could feel the stares like a physical burn on her skin. She stumbled, her steps faltering. Ethan pulled her closer, his lips near her ear. "Let them look," he whispered, his voice a fierce, possessive growl. "You are mine." The words broke through her fear. They were a brand, a claim, a declaration that echoed in the deepest parts of her soul. She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with sudden tears. They were not tears of shame or fear. They were tears of a joy so profound, so overwhelming. It felt like her heart would burst. He was not ashamed of her. He was proud. He was claiming her, here, in front of everyone. In that moment, the whispers faded away. The stares lost their power. There was, as he had promised, no one else in the world but the two of them. A sob of pure happiness escaped her lips, and she rested her head against his chest. Her world, finally, irrevocably, righting itself. They finished the waltz in their own private world, but as the music ended and they stood, breathless, in the center of the floor, a new voice cut through the air, a voice thick with malice and cheap whiskey. Well, if it ain't Rollins, I knew you were lonely. But I didn't think you were so desperate you'd start paying for your company from the kitchen staff." The voice belonged to Silas Croft. He was a rival rancher, a bull of a man with a florid face and small, mean eyes. He and Ethan had a long history of bad blood over land and water rights, and Croft had always come out on the losing end. He now stood blocking their path, a cruel smirk on his face, his gaze openly insulting as it roamed over Abigail. The barn fell completely silent. The only sound was the nervous squeak of the fiddle as the musician lowered his bow. Ethan's body went rigid. He gently moved Abigail behind him, a subtle, protective gesture that put him squarely between her and the threat. His face became the granite mask she had seen when she first arrived, but his eyes were not empty. They were chips of ice, glittering with a cold, lethal rage. "You've had too much to drink." "Croft," Ethan said, his voice dangerously calm. "Go sleep it off before you say something you'll regret." Croft laughed. A loud, ugly bark. Regret I don't regret telling the truth. Everyone here is thinking it. How much did she cost you for the night, Rollins? Or is she giving it away for free in hopes of getting her hands on your name? He took a lurching step forward. I've got a silver dollar right here, says she's not too picky about whose. He never finished the sentence. Ethan moved with a speed that was terrifying. It wasn't a clumsy, drunken brawl. It was the clean, economical motion of a predator. One moment he was standing still. The next his hand had blurred to his hip, and the resounding crack of his Colt Peacemaker echoed through the cavernous barn. Silas Croft cried out, a high, thin squeal of pain, and staggered backward, clutching his right shoulder. His own pistol, which he had just begun to draw, clattered to the floor. A dark stain began to spread across the fabric of his shirt. Silence. A thick, shocked silence hung in the air, heavy with the smell of gunpowder. Everyone was frozen, staring at the scene. Silas Croft on his knees, whimpering in pain, and Ethan Rollins standing over him, his pistol still smoking in his hand, his face a mask of cold, implacable fury. Ethan didn't spare Croft another glance. He calmly holstered his weapon and turned to the stunned crowd. His gaze swept over their pale, frightened faces, and his voice, when he spoke, was as sharp and cold as a winter wind. This woman, he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority, is Abigail Thorne. Her honor is my honor. If anyone here has a problem with that, you can take it up with me, now. He waited, letting the challenge hang in the air. Not a soul moved. Not a voice was raised. He had drawn a line, not just in the dust of the barn floor, but in the social fabric of the entire county. His point made, he turned his back on them all. He reached for Abigail, who stood behind him, her eyes wide, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock and awe. He took her hand, his touch now gentle and reassuring. Come, he said softly, let's go home. And without a backward glance, he led her out of the silent barn, away from the whispers and the judgment, and back into the golden lantern light, a king leading his queen from the field of battle. The ride home from the Miller barn was a journey through a dreamscape. A brilliant moon hung in the ink-black sky, turning the snow-covered landscape to silver and shadow. The only sounds were the creak of the buggy's wheels, the soft thud of the horses' hooves, and the quiet, steady rhythm of their breathing. The chaos of the barn, the shouting, the gunshot, the smell of gunpowder seemed a world away, a violent nightmare from which they had both awoken. Abigail sat close to Ethan, the warmth of his body a solid, comforting presence against the chill of the night. She was still trembling, not from cold or fear, but from the aftershocks of the evening's events. He had defended her. He had stood before the entire world, a world that scorned and judged her, and he had claimed her. Asterisk. Her honor is my honor. The words replayed in her mind, a powerful, sacred anthem. It was only when they reached the ambient light of the ranch house that she saw the dark stain on his coat sleeve, near the elbow. You're hurt, she breathed, her hand flying to his arm. He glanced down, his expression dismissive. It's nothing. A splinter from the wall when the bullet ricocheted. It just grazed me. It is not nothing, she insisted, her voice gaining a strength and authority that surprised them both. Inside the great room, she took charge. The timid serving girl was gone, replaced by a woman with a singular, determined purpose. Sit, she commanded, pointing to his large leather armchair. To his credit, he sat without argument, a flicker of surprised admiration in his eyes as he watched her. She bustled about, lighting an extra lamp, fetching the medical box from Mrs. Henderson's pantry, and putting a kettle on for hot water. She worked with a quiet, focused efficiency, her movements sure and steady. When she returned to his side and began to roll up his sleeve, her touch was not the hesitant, feather-light brush of a servant, but the firm, gentle touch of a caregiver. The wound was, as he'd said, minor a long, angry scrape where a piece of wood had torn through his coat and shirt, leaving a shallow but bloody furrow in his skin. But to Abigail, it was a testament, a physical mark of his devotion. This wound was her fault. It was a price he had paid for her. She cleaned it with methodical care, her brow furrowed in concentration. He sat perfectly still, not from stoicism, but because he was mesmerized. He watched the way the lamplight caught the soft strands of her hair, the gentle curve of her neck as she bent over his arm, the fierce tenderness in her expression. He had seen her frightened, seen her exhausted, seen her brave, but this was new. This was Abigail in her full power, a woman of quiet, unshakable strength. He had fought to protect her, and now she was here, healing him. When she was finished, her hands bandaging the wound with neat, precise folds, she looked up and found him watching her, his gaze so intense, so full of love. It made her breath catch in her throat. He reached up with his uninjured hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. The words were for more than the bandage. They were for everything. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief second. "I was so scared." She confessed. "There's nothing to be scared of anymore," he said. "I'll never let anyone hurt you again." But as the night deepened and the house settled into its familiar silence, the reality of his promise began to weigh on her. She lay in her small attic bed, staring into the darkness. But she did not see his loving gaze. She saw the shocked, pale faces in the barn. She heard the echo of the gunshot. She saw Silas Croft, crumpled on the floor, his shirt soaked in blood. "I'll never let anyone hurt you again." His words, meant to comfort, became a source of torment. He had protected her, yes, but in doing so, he had been forced to become a man he was not. Ethan Rollins was a builder, a creator, a man who brought order to the wild land. He was not a brawler, a duelist who shot men in crowded barns. She had brought this violence into his life. Silas Croft's words, though vile and false, had contained a kernel of truth that now festered in her heart. She was a disruption, a source of chaos. Her love for him, which had felt so pure and triumphant just hours before, now seemed like a selfish, destructive force. She was a liability. Because of her, he had made an enemy of a powerful neighbor. Because of her, his name, the name he had guarded so carefully since Sarah's death, was now irrevocably tied to scandal and violence. How long before another Silas Croft came along? How long before Ethan was forced to draw his gun again, perhaps with a deadlier result? The realization settled upon her with the crushing weight of a headstone. To love him was to endanger him. To stay with him was to condemn him to a life of looking over his shoulder, of defending her honor against a world that would never accept her. She thought of his dead wife, Sarah. The townsfolk had spoken her name with respect. She had been his partner, a woman who had brought grace and peace to his life. Abigail, in contrast, brought only trouble. She was a ghost from a dark past, and she was trailing her shadows into his bright, new future. The decision, when it came, was the most painful thing she had ever conceived. It felt like tearing out her own heart, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was the only right thing to do. The only way to truly protect him was to disappear from his life. It was the one last, ultimate act of love she could give him. Before the first hint of dawn, she rose. She moved with the same quiet grace as always. But now her purpose was different. She packed her few belongings into her small carpet bag, a spare dress, a brush, the small, worn Bible that had been her mother's. She had almost nothing, just as when she had arrived. She sat at the small kitchen table and, by the light of a single candle, she wrote him a letter. Her hand trembled, and tears blurred the ink, but she forced the words out. Asterisk, my dearest Ethan. Asterisk, you saved me, and now I must save you. I cannot be the cause of any more pain or violence in your life. The world will not let us be. and I will not be the reason your good name is ruined. Please do not look for me. Know only that I will carry the memory of your kindness in my heart for all of my days. You gave me back my life. Now I give you back yours. Asterisk, yours, always. Asterisk, Abigail, asterisk. She folded the note, her heart breaking with every crease. She left it on the mantelpiece in the great room, where she had once left him a blanket and a cup of tea. She looked around the room one last time, memorizing the shape of his chair, the pattern on the rug, the way the firelight had danced on the walls. This house had been her sanctuary. It had been her home. With her bag in her hand, she crept to the great oak door, her hand hovering over the brass handle she had polished just that morning. One more step, and she would be gone, a ghost once more. And where do you think you're going? The voice came from the shadows at the top of the staircase. It was low and rough with sleep, but it stopped her as surely as if a hand had clamped down on her shoulder. Ethan stood there, his arm in a makeshift sling she had made for him, his eyes burning into her in the dim, pre-dawn light. She froze, her back to him.
I have to leave,
she stammered, her voice thick with tears.
It's for the best.
He descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, his footsteps echoing in the silent house. He came to a stop just behind her. She could feel his warmth, his presence, a powerful magnetic pull that she had to fight with every ounce of her will. For the best, he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. You think leaving me is for the best? I bring you trouble, she whispered, turning to face him, the tears now streaming down her cheeks. Last night, a man was shot because of me. Your name is being dragged through the mud. I am a scandal. Ethan, I am a danger to you. If I stay, this will only continue. I won't be the ruin of you. He looked at her tear-streaked face, at the small, pathetic bag in her hand, and the anger he felt was eclipsed by a wave of love so fierce it almost brought him to his knees. He reached out and gently took the bag from her hand, dropping it to the floor with a soft thud. He took her hands in his. The ruin of me, he said, his voice shaking with a powerful emotion she couldn't name. Abigail, do you have any idea what my life was before you came here? I was already ruined. I was a ghost. This house was a mausoleum filled with memories I couldn't escape. I had land, I had money, and every single morning I woke up wishing I hadn't. That was my ruin. He pulled her closer, his gaze intense, willing her to understand. You didn't bring trouble here. You brought life. You lit a fire in a house that was dark and cold. You made me feel again. Last night, that wasn't a scandal. That was me, finally having something worth fighting for, something worth protecting. He lifted a hand to her face, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. His voice dropped to a raw, vulnerable whisper she had never heard from him before.
I once had everything,
he said, his eyes holding hers, sharing the weight of his entire past, a wife, a son, a life. And then I lost it all, everything. I closed my heart. Abigail, I locked it away and swore I would never feel that kind of loss again. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his heart in his eyes. But when I met you, when I saw your strength and your kindness, you broke down every wall I ever built. You made me choose again. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his voice thick with the finality of an unbreakable vow. I choose you. Forever. The words were the key that unlocked the last of her fears. They were not just a declaration. They were an absolution. He was not a man she was destroying. He was a man she was completing. His choice was so absolute, so powerful. It gave her the strength to make her own. She was no longer a frightened girl running from shadows. She was a woman, loved by this man, and she would stand and face the world with him. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. And the sobs that came were not of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, soul-shattering relief. He held her tight, his good arm wrapped around her like a steel band, and they stood there in the gray light of the new dawn, Two broken souls who had found their way back to life, together. The decision had been made. Their future had begun. They were married on a Tuesday in late spring, when the land was lush and green with new life. There was no grand ceremony in a church, no crowd of well-wishers, no lavish feast. Their wedding was as quiet and profound as the love it celebrated. Their only witnesses were the vast Wyoming sky, a stoic Jed who stood as Ethan's best man, and a surprisingly tearful Mrs. Henderson, who held a small bouquet of wild prairie roses for the bride. The spot Ethan chose was the one place on the entire ranch that was both the most sacred and the most sorrowful, the small, grassy hill crowned by the lone cottonwood tree. Beneath its rustling leaves were two simple wooden crosses, weathered by 3 years of sun and snow. Sarah, Thomas, when he had told Abigail where he wished for them to be married, she had looked at him, her gray eyes wide with a question he understood without her speaking a word. Was it right to begin their new life in the shadow of his old one? He had taken her hand and simply said, "They were my life. You are my life now. The two are not at war. They are part of the same story. My story." And she had understood. She wore the same blue calico dress from the barn dance, a silent testament to the night he had claimed her. Her hair was not pulled back in its severe bun, but was loosely plaited with a few of the wild roses Mrs. Henderson had given her. She had never looked more beautiful. As she stood before him on that quiet hill, with the gentle wind whispering through the cottonwood leaves, she was not a servant, not a fugitive, not a victim. She was a queen in a calico dress, the undisputed ruler of his heart. A traveling preacher, a gaunt man with a kind face whom Ethan had summoned from Cheyenne, performed the simple service. His voice was a low, humble murmur against the vastness of the landscape. He spoke of love, of companionship, of weathering storms together. His words were simple, but for Ethan and Abigail, they were imbued with the weight of all they had endured. When the time came for the vows, Ethan turned to Abigail. Taking both of her hands in his, he didn't recite the traditional words. He spoke from a place so deep within him. It was as if he were pulling the words directly from his soul. "Abigail Thorne," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I stood on this hill 3 years ago and thought my life was over. The world was gray and silent. I built walls around my heart so thick and so high. I thought nothing could ever get through. And then you came. You didn't tear the walls down. You were just, you were quiet and kind and brave. You tended a fire in a cold house, and you didn't even know you were tending one in a cold man. You showed me that a heart can break, and it can heal, that it can love, and it can love again." He squeezed her hands, his gaze unwavering. "I cannot promise you a life without hardship. This land is hard, but I promise to stand between you and the storm. I promise to honor you, to protect you, and to cherish you for all the days of my life. You are my spring after a long winter. You are my home." Tears streamed freely down Abigail's face as she spoke her own vows, her voice a soft, clear whisper that the wind seemed to carry up to the heavens. "Ethan Rollins, I came here with nothing but fear. You gave me safety. You gave me a voice when I had none. You looked at me and saw not what I was, but who I am. You are the bravest, kindest man I have ever known. I will love you, and I will stand by you. Forever." When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Ethan did not kiss her with the fiery passion of the line shack or the desperate relief of the barn. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers with a tenderness that spoke of utter devotion, a kiss that was a quiet, sacred promise. After the preacher had been paid and sent on his way, and Jed and Mrs. Henderson had made a tactful retreat back to the ranch house, Ethan and Abigail remained on the hill alone. The sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and violet. Ethan led her to the 2 wooden crosses. He stood before them for a long moment, his hand resting on the weathered wood of Sarah's marker. Abigail stood beside him, her hand in his, a silent, supportive presence. She did not feel like an intruder. She felt like a part of his story, a new chapter being written in a book that held both sorrow and joy. He didn't speak aloud. He didn't need to. He spoke to them in the quiet of his heart. Asterisk Sarah. Asterisk, he thought, his gaze soft. Asterisk. You would have liked her. She's strong, like you were, kind, too. I'm happy again. I didn't think it was possible. I hope you have found your peace, and I hope you can be at peace with this. He looked at the smaller cross. Asterisk Thomas. My boy, your mother and I are watching over you, always. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. It was not a forgetting. It was an acceptance. He was not replacing his past. He was honoring it by choosing to live again. He turned from the graves and looked at his wife, his Abigail, her face glowing in the warm light of the setting sun. His future. Let's go home, he said, his voice full of a contentment so deep it was almost a prayer. They walked back to the house hand in hand, their long shadows stretching out before them. The house was no longer the imposing, empty mansion he had rattled around in for years. It looked different now, bathed in the soft twilight. It looked welcoming. It looked like a home. Inside, the great room was quiet. A fire had been laid in the hearth but not lit. The air was cool and filled with the scent of beeswax and the wild roses in Abigail's hair. For months, this fireplace had been the center of their unspoken world. It had been the place of his secret observations, the place she had unknowingly brought warmth back into his life, the symbol of a tiny flame she had kept alive against the darkness. Ethan went to the mantelpiece and picked up the bellows. He turned and held them out to Abigail. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. He smiled, a true, easy smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. This is your house now. Abigail, our house. It's only right that you light the first fire of our new life. She took the bellows, but she didn't move toward the hearth. Instead, she held them out to him. No, she said softly, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable love. Not me, us. He understood. He came and stood beside her, placing his large, calloused hand over her smaller one on the handle of the bellows. Together, they knelt on the hearthrug. Together, they aimed the nozzle at the kindling. Together, they pumped, sending a steady stream of air onto the waiting wood. A tiny spark caught, then another. A small, tentative flame flickered to life, dancing on a piece of dry cedar. It grew, licking at the larger logs, until a warm, steady fire was burning, casting a golden, dancing light across the room. It pushed back the shadows, filling the cavernous space with a vibrant, living warmth. They remained kneeling there for a long time, not speaking, simply watching the flames. His hand was still over hers, their warmth mingling with the heat from the fire. The silence in the room was no longer empty or lonely. It was full. It was full of peace, of promise, and of a love that had been tested by ice and fire, by grief and prejudice, and had emerged stronger and more brilliant than either of them could have ever imagined. The house finally had its heart back, and this time they would tend the flame together. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And to help this story be heard by more people, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.